I would like to introduce everyone to our panel, Wolf, Europe, Histories and Capitalism, Where Are We Now? And this panel is actually a product of a conference that was organized in Bergen by Don Kalb and Susana Narotzky. We've adjusted it, but so the papers have really been thought through and redone, and we've added people, so we think it's going to be very exciting. And it's had a lot of input and thought. And then we brought it to the AAA for your, to get more input and engage with each other on the topic. The reason we thought that it's very important to discuss Eric Wolf now, you know, his book, Europe and the People Without History, came out in 1982, so it's 40 years. And it was like a landmark. It was like a statement, a fundamental statement for historical materialism. Many of us were doing this work at the time. Many of us were trained at other places, but Eric Wolf at CUNY was like a ballast. There was a lot of this kind of thinking through the 70s after 1968, thinking about imperialism, thinking about capitalism, thinking about working classes, peasant rebellions, peasant wars. These were the topics after 1968, the topics of the 70s and 80s. And they were, for a period, very central. A lot of people came to anthropology to think about these questions, which previously had been sort of not so easy to discuss. And Eric Wolf wrote the fundamental edifice which reflected that work and laid the foundation for future work. So that was 40 years ago. Questions of class, questions of mode of production, questions of migration, labor changes, processes over time, when do we define capitalism? All of these are discussed. And obviously, we still refer to it in terms of thinking where we are now. So obviously, capitalism, the regimes of capital have changed in 40 years. We're dealing with many, many different problems. And the issues today, the rethinking that is necessary, is what we're trying to begin, what we tried to begin in Bergen, and what we are currently discussing today. And we hope that this will help with reinventing the paradigm which was much attacked with, you know, postmodern turn and things like that, where Wolf became kind of the pariah, and anthropology, and, you know, there were all kind of rather vicious disagreements, so that Marxism sort of got pressed down from where it had been after 68. And we hope that this session will allow us to reconfigure and think about the transformations of capitalism over the past 40 years, and as a beginning for further rethinking. I'm sorry to say Sharryn Kasmir is not feeling well today, so when it comes to her, I'll read her paper. So how are we doing this in order? Should we go like this, where you're sitting? Don Kalb is first. I'll go by where you're sitting.
Are we ready? Yeah, so I don't have my glasses on, I don't see you, but I know you're out there.
We're imagining there.
Eric Wolf, you're in the People About History. I'm going to talk about the text. I'm going to talk about the relevance of the text. I will critique the text from our current situation. But I also will open with a comparison of two rivaling global historical anthropologies that are around. David Graeber and Jack Goody. I won't go into detail with the two of them because I don't have the time for that. Because I have a big paper, goes into all of that, but I will sort of cut it short. So we have 15 minutes?
Yes. You want me to time? I should time. Okay.
First, a few words about Graeber and Goody, because there is a certain elective affinity among these two competing global historical anthropologies in relationship to Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History. And the affinity is in the idealism. So Graeber is the specialist on everyday communism. And he's basically the inheritor of a long tradition of utopian socialism. You can say Marcel Mauss was of course very important for him, but Marcel Mauss is also an inheritor of an earlier tradition. And I would say Graeber stands on the shoulders of utopian socialism. Utopian socialism that had historically, when it was emerging in Europe, embraced the noble savage as a counterpoint to commercial civilization. In a similar way, Jack Goody focuses on, Graeber talks, the noble savage is of course located in the global south, right, in the primitive world. Jack Goody focuses on Eurasia. That is an innovation in anthropology, and I think the discipline as such has not dealt sufficiently with that. Goody's vision is one that's entirely based on bourgeoisies, on the culture of cities, of the culture of merchants. Goody's argument is basically that there's a Eurocentrism historically that thinks that modernity and capitalism are developed in the West. And his claim is, no, that is Eurasian product. It has always developed in an alternation between cores in the west of the Eurasian continent and cores in the east of the Eurasian continent. They learned from each other, copied each other, and in sort of cooperative competitivism developed capitalism. Now, that is interesting because in political theory, of course, the East is barbarism. So what you see, if you say that David Graeber thematizes the noble savage, you can say that Jack Goody sings the song of the rational barbarian. The rational barbarian is a barbarian located in cities, not in tyrannies, and the cities push a continuous innovation in all sorts of ways, civil society, literature, romance, theology, but also skills, technology, etc. And so you have two competing visions of large-scale historical process that are actually about modes of morality. The morality of the noble savage and the morality of the rational barbarian. Now, Europe and the People Without History, and basically Wolf's trajectory, was one precisely of acting against idealism. Right? So modes of morality cannot be forms of explanation, certainly not of large-scale historical transformations. So Wolf develops in Europe and the People Without History three notions of modes of production that are supposed to do a lot of explanatory work. And so it's modes of production against modes of morality. Now the importance of Wolf at this point in time is that we can continue to think, perhaps not about modes of production. I'm ambivalent about the concept, and I think it's less important in Marx than Althusser thinks. But can we analyze the contradictions of the 21st century only in terms of modes of morality, right? And so there's something that we need to take out of Wolf into the present that must be kept in order for us to understand and to cope with, analytically and politically, the contradictions, the common contradictions of the 21st century. All right. Having said this, there's also an interesting difference in time frames. Right? So while Wolff uses the classic Marxian 500 years period, 1400, 1900, the book stops in 1910 more or less, before the First World War, it's not insignificant in itself. The two other global historical anthropologies have a much longer time frame, right? So Graeber 5,000 years, Goody 2,000 years. So there's also an important difference there. And of course, when you stretch it up, the classic idea of the capitalist breakthrough, whether liberal or Marxist, sort of disappears in its importance, right? So there is a sort of coherence there. If you have the very long-term view, thousands of years, you tend towards modes of morality, and you tend to talk about, the actual age, theology, culture, rather than capitalism. Now, my point is also here, can we think longer term but retain capitalism and retain capital? Now, so the key problems for Wolff, is my claim, are precisely in this concept of the mode of production and related in his notion of culture and ideology. So these are the two key problems, and they are related. Because, of course, Wolff comes up with the mode of production in order to do away with culture. So my argument is actually that Wolff becomes a victim to his own program of attacking German idealism with what I think is not an entirely dialectical materialism. Okay, let's move on. In a practical sense, in a more historical and precise empirical sense, this is about two key things. Wolff misses historical liberalism as an ideology. And secondly, he misses the importance of the bourgeois revolution. Here's my bow to Jack Goody. I think Goody is right. There is something like the culture of cities, but it's not a culture of cities. It's the making of the bourgeois class, the international formation of the bourgeois class. That is important. So it's about politics and ideology. In the end, Wolff, Europe and the people without history, fails to give, in my idea, history back to the people without history. And that is because they don't really make history. They cope with the direct problems of exploitation, but they never develop counter-ideologies against capitalism. Whatever sort of counter-ideologies. Socialism is absent in the book. Very strange. Nationalism is absent. Ethno-nationalism, racism is absent. All the, let us say, the ideological interlocutions of liberalism, the counter-politics against liberalism, is absent in the book. And that is because the politics of liberalism is absent. So there's a coherence there. Of course, Wolff has this afterword, where he deals with culture and ideology. It's quite a brilliant afterword. It's a very necessary afterword, after having done nothing on that field in the whole book, basically. But it's exceedingly short, and comes too late. And it should have been in the beginning, and should have been part of his problematic of a Europe that subjects the rest of the world and the rest of the world population to its capitalist logics. Now, when you look at the chapters, the movement of commodities and the new laborers are important chapters, and we should not forget that, right? At this point in time, it's easily to not be aware of the fact that, for example, in 1975, the International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, there was not one entry on labor. There was not an entry on class, right? And so Wolff acts in that particular conjuncture. And so whatever he does here in these chapters on the movement of commodities and the new laborers are actually very important moves at that point in time. But the emphasis is on economics and migrations. So cultural ideological process is very small, often restricted just to ethnicity. The urban is hardly discussed at all. Socialism is absent, right? So in the end, Wolff and the people without history is not dealing with working class formation, for example. And this is all in the context of a period, 1880-1910, where you have massive working class, the generation of working classes everywhere in the world. It's key for capitalism. But the idea of working class formation, let us say, the classic Thompsonian idea that these working classes are starting to talk back, is absolutely absent. Communism is absent. But most tellingly of all, liberalism is absent. So the ideology under which historical capitalism is politically produced and sustained makes zero appearance in the book. Capitalism, Europe itself, apparently arrived on the world stage without any ideological program of note. So no wonder that we do not find in Europe and the People Without History any country program. So in Europe and the People Without History, there are histories of people and histories of modes of production, but where is history with a big H? Capital H history is absent. Capital H history is basically the rolling out of capitalism as a mode of production, as a form of rule, but there is no politics. It is a sort of techno self-realization. So, and why only a short, supremely general reprise in the afterword about culture and ideology? So paradoxically, while Europe and the People Without History was a powerful political intervention in academia, but without socialism, liberalism, and all the rest, this is actually a book without politics. I need to talk a little bit about liberalism and the bourgeois revolution to make this clear. So, the definition of capitalism in Wolff is a very Brennerian definition, right? So it's the penetration into production by capital. So it's the subjection of the working class on the workshop floor. That's a sort of techno-managerial process, and it just rolls over the world in the vision of Wolff. But capitalism emerges for Wolff under another mode of production, which is the tributary mode, as you know, right? So three modes of production: kinship, tributary, capitalist. The tributary mode basically reigns from a few thousand years before Christ till about 1800, and of course with a tail. But under the tributary mode, Wolff is aware that you have mercantile capitalism emerging, you have cities emerging, you have the whole network of already proto-colonies, you have the colonization of the USA going on, of what is becoming the USA going on. So Europe expands massively by 1800, so that is before the capitalist mode of production a la Wolff has emerged. By 1800, 70% of the world is actually controlled by a northwestern outpost of Eurasia that nobody had heard of before, right? And that happened in not more than 400 years' time. And it happened under the ideology of liberalism, right? So liberalism is the ideology under which the emergent transnational bourgeoisie, transnational class of the bourgeoisie, attacks, in the Wolffian terms, the tributary regimes of feudalism, of absolutism, of Asiatic despotism, etc. Now, the importance of that is that it shifts the idea of what capital does and what capital is away from a narrow view in production towards a much broader view of world making, of liberal world making, that includes dispossession, primitive accumulation, and of course, very important, war making, right? So the whole period 1400, 1800 is just one long period of massive war making. Jack Goody talks a little bit about this in terms of, the West had, because Goody is incredibly empiricist, right? He tells narratives, historical narratives, but it never becomes a very sort of serious and sustained theorization of what he's doing. So for Goody, this is all about guns and sales, literally, this is the quote, right? So guns and sales does this, but guns and sales is a program, is a pattern, it's brought to the world under the notion of liberalism, the attack against the savages, the attack against the barbarians, And it is capital. It is capital emergent, capital subjecting space, appropriating space, primitive accumulation, setting the thing on fire. Now, the importance is, of course, entirely clear, because at this point in time, in the 21st century, under sort of techno-financialized capital, the sort of narrow, Brennerian exploitation of labor in production is, of course, very important. You know, that is what made China into the unit that it is now. But it is certainly not the paradigm of rule anymore, right? And so we need to expand. If we want to update Wolff for the 21st century, we need to go back into history, paradoxically, because you need a sort of Brodelian conception of capital, right? For Goody, Goody's books actually, or books, it's a series of 6 books. Goody's books focus one particular city more than any other city, and that is Venice, right? And so Goody is very, very close to a Brodelian idea of what capital is, what capitalism does. I think that is something that a renewed Wolff should take up, but in a broad sense of international bourgeois class formation. How much time do I have? How much? 2 minutes. Yeah, very good. Well, do I need those 2 minutes? I think I've said what I wanted to say.
Actually, you cannot.
Yeah, I've said what I wanted to say. Okay. But I think these are the core. So, ideology and politics, an expanded conception of capital that is, you know, rent here taken. That's about the mass more than the rate, to talk with Harvey. That is also the anti-market in many ways. You know, the techno-financial capital paradigms are about the anti-market. You organize a market underneath you, but you extract from that market permanent rents. You force that market into your standards and into your platforms. And of course, you close the doors to competitors, right? And that is what is in fact happening between, you know, the firewall of China and its techno-financial or digital financial paradigms and the ones controlled by the USA. So if we want to update Wolff for a present, is the politics of liberalism, the counter-politics against liberalism, and an expanded conception of capital and capitalism that we can actually ground historically very well. I forgot one important thing, and this is the final sort of a conclusion. The idea that liberalism and democracy are congruent. And you see that already from this sort of alternative reading of the rise of capitalism, is entirely wrong, right? So capitalism has always been driven by liberalism, by small communities of investor owners who want to keep large sections of society out of the rule over capital, right? So democracy emerges basically on the basis of all these counter-politics against liberalism in the late 19th century, around the First World War. Then you have, at once in 1918, you have the breakthrough of democracy, which then becomes a rule. But it is not what liberalism likes, right? And so from that very moment onward, you have neoliberalism emerging as a way to lift the control over capital accumulation out of the democratic sphere. And then, of course, after 1973, 75, you get that project going again massively. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is Jaume Franquesa.
Hi. So my paper is an attempt to understand Eric Wolff's political ecology. This stems from, I guess, my interest in understanding how the legacy of Eric Wolff can be used, or the limits of using it for political ecological analysis. It also emerges from, I would say, what I would call a pretty stringent paradox. If we take just as an example, like Paul Robbins's textbook, Political Ecology, probably the most well sold, the bestseller in textbooks of political ecology written by a geographer. We see that he tells us that the first person to use the term political ecology is Eric Wolf. Actually, one of the prizes here of the environment and Society for the Anthropological Environment, whatever it's called, Anthropology and Environment, has the name of Eric Wolf in the prize. He also tells us that peasant studies with Wolf at the helm was central in the kind of the energy that will coalesce at some point into political ecology. But then Eric Wolf and anything that sounds like Eric Wolf is more or less absent from the rest of the textbook. So how come? In order to try to understand this, what I did was a close reading mostly of Europe and the People Without History, but also trying to understand a broader trajectory, very much starting with Julian Stewart, going through the Puerto Rico Project and Eric Wolf. But I will here just be a bit more concrete because I don't have time, and focus just on a little bit on the Alpine ethnography of Eric Wolf, and then go into Europe and the People Without History. Just in case I run out of time, I will say kind of what my conclusion is that whereas political ecology emerges out of a process of convergence of an interest in ecological questions with political economy, in Eric Wolf, the more invested he keeps getting into political economic questions, the more that ecology keeps kind of falling out of his framework of analysis. I'll try to provide some evidence of what I'm saying. And this has a lot to do, by the way, and this I coincide with Don, in a not political enough understanding of capitalism. So again, the mention of political ecology that Wolf did is in the title of a 1972 review piece or commentary piece that was linked to his Alpine ethnography, where he was comparing a German-speaking and a Roman-speaking community in the Alps. The term political ecology is not mentioned in the monograph that came out of it together with John Cole, but in the re-edition, the second edition of the book in 1999, 25 years later, in the preface, Wolf and Cole do say that what they were doing there is political ecology, even if they did not give it this name. Now, I don't know if what they call political ecology, or I actually have doubts of what they call political ecology in that second edition, or what Wolf calls political ecology in the title of this piece, the 1972 piece that becomes kind of the first, let's say, modern use of the term political ecology. I'm not sure that it means the same that what we mean nowadays by political ecology. His political ecology in a way is very political, very focused on the state, whereas questions of market and capitalism, so central to today's political ecology, play a more subdued role. And I'm quoting, "Complex societies are ecologically grounded, but the rise of the state introduces into the ecological set a specifically political element that transforms problems of ecological limitations into decisions of political economy." So what does he mean by, in a way, the ecological problems being superseded by questions of political economy? Well, later on in the book, they give us a good hint of what they mean. And again, I quote, "The market," they say, "may indeed be seen as a set of mechanisms designed to challenge local ecological adaptations and reallocate resources in ways unique at the local level." And they continue saying, "There is a specific way in which the market is anti-ecological." Now, this, of course, could be seen as the beginning of an ecology of capitalism, but I don't think this is what they do. They focus on the tendency of capital, and also the state, but mostly capital, to transform all conditions of production into what they call free-floating resources that are not embedded in any given context, environment, or group. In other words, it seems like what Cole and Wolf mean when they speak of the market as anti-ecological is that the market aims, and in large part succeeds at, liberating itself from environmental constraints. What one misses in this formulation is, at the very least, that the authors would need to complement their characterization of capitalism as anti-ecological, i.e. autonomous from ecological servitudes, by saying that it is also anti-environmental. That is to say that capitalism involved a quantum leap in the scale and speed of environmental degradation. And this would have opened the door to the kind of the Marxist environmental critique that basically emerged from the 70s onwards. Of course, maybe all these questions, I'm now talking all the time about the Alpine ethnography, maybe all these questions could only emerge at a later stage in Wolff's work. Indeed, if he was to offer an environmental analysis of capitalism, we could say that this had to happen in his magnum opus, Europe and the People Without History, where he set himself to the task of building a systematic account of the genesis and spread of European colonialism and the capitalist mode of production. Now, how much time do I have at this point?
10 minutes.
Okay, good. So if we go to Europe and the People Without History, and I'm going to, hopefully I don't sound too Talmudic in how I speak about the book, but there's three parts. The first is kind of the previous, both theory and the previous stage to the onset of European expansion. The second one is what he calls these mercantile empires, 16th to 18th century, and the third part is capitalism proper. He's very clear that these mercantile empires are not capitalist, right? So if we go to the first page, the first part, it is clear that the question of nature is central to his concept of production, which is the central concept in the book, and that he's clear that production embraces the changing relations of humankind to nature, social relations into which humans enter in the course of transforming nature. So nature is very central in his understanding of production. And he says something very interesting, the way in which the mode of capitalist mode of production, a mode commits social labor to the transformation of nature, also governs the way the resources used and obtained are distributed among producers and non-producers. More importantly, in chapter 4, which is the one that sets the stage for European expansion, questions of environment and natural endowment really become central. The goal of this chapter is to provide the key to read the transition between the world of 1400 and the era of European mercantile expansion. That is the substance of part 2. And the bulk of the chapter is concerned with what I would call the ecological regimes of each of the Western European polities he surveys. So to put it like in Jason Moore's terms, when he talks, for instance, about the Dutch, is this idea about Amsterdam is a standing on Norway, right? On all the, basically the Baltic trade. So Wolff's main argument in there is that the point of departure for European expansion, that which motivated a series of Western European polities to expand around the world, is the crisis of feudalism, or rather the aim of getting out of it. And this process of overcoming this crisis is described as an environmental geographical process, and more specifically as one of finding, creating, and incorporating new resource frontiers. I quote, the way out of the crisis lay in the discovery of new frontiers. Economically, the crisis of feudalism was solved by locating, seizing, and distributing resources available beyond the European confines. So we set the stage for part 2 as basically an environmental process, European expansion. And this is what we see especially in chapters 5 and 6 about the New World. Basically we're told in chapter 5, for instance, that the Iberian expansion in the core areas of pre-Columbine state-making, Central America and the Andes, involved the destruction of old ecological patterns and the creation of new landscape adjusted to the accumulation needs of the metropolis. So, and I'll just go to the part 3. So the point I'm trying to make is when he's dealing with what he deems to be the prologue to capitalism, but not capitalism itself, it's a very ecological process that he's describing, and he's describing it in very ecological terms. Now, when we move to the capitalism mode of production in the third part, this environmental reading is much less straightforward. It's true that one of the chapters is quintessentially about resources and chapter 11, environment and all these. And indeed, he follows a similar logic to understand the kind of 1870s, 1890s period of crisis and imperialist competition, very much as one in which decreasing rates of profit need to be counteracted by the creation of new resource frontiers around the world, basically creating frontiers for production of foodstuffs and the extraction of raw materials, creating a new round of uneven development. So capital basically tells us, in other words, found in the creation of new resources, the fix, using Harvey's expression from the book at the same time, 1982, to the class struggle through nature. However, whereas what he's describing has obvious ecological implications, his analytical framework is less ecological. So for instance, a couple of examples I think will help understand this. When he talks about the plantation, he talks about the plantation as an invader of other modes of production. But he never mentions the importance of the way in which the plantation expropriated the free gifts of nature, most notably the natural productivity of soil. Or when he talks about industrialization, he puts a lot of emphasis in the increase in the use of energy that comes with industrialization, but that increase of energy is seen as a pure mechanical response to the increase in productivity. It's never seen as problematic. Basically, if capital needs more energy, it'll find that energy. So if it needs more fuel will be found. So my point is that whereas Wolff puts in part 3 a lot of emphasis in showing how the capitalist mode of production is able to recruit more laborers into its expanding operations and analyzing the consequences of this process, he has very little to say about how capitalism enrolls nature. It seems obvious. It needs more nature, it gets it. And when he discusses this incorporation of nature, these processes, the processes that are at the heart of it, like unequal exchange, are presented as secondary to the operation of capitalism. And this is, to go to the kind of the bottom of my argument, very much linked in this particular case to the use of this Brennerian definition of capitalism, where, as I said, everything that happens before, the use of this kind of purist definition of capitalism that's all to do about the mobilization of social labor tends to exclude processes of accumulation by extra economic means. We could say tends to exclude the permanent operation of primitive accumulation. And of course, when we exclude that operation of primitive accumulation, these extra economic mechanisms, what we start seeing is that nature kind of fades out of the picture. So he is not able, I would say, to include the environment into his understanding of capitalism as a kind of core feature of it. Things like commodity frontiers, the intervention of the state, or processes of dispossession, in this third part become kind of accidental, not central to the way capitalism expands. Of course, the Wolff is too good of an anthropologist to conceal them, yet his theory is too narrow for these processes to be incorporated as central to the understanding of capitalism, and he is forced to present them as kind of anomalies. In the same movement of presenting these processes as anomalies, the environment gets pushed to the side. Here, an anomaly that will be soon incorporated, there, a factor of production that can always be substituted for, let's say, energy, for instance, if capital's organizational capacity is at full speed. So, so my conclusion is that Wolff's intellectual trajectory kind of went the opposite direction of what we see with the formation of political ecology. Whereas political ecology is basically emerges out of the need to politicize all the frameworks, like cultural ecology and all that. In Wolff's case, when he went fully political economic, let's say, in Europe and the people without history, he became less ecological. And these, I think, and again, there like in the last point we coincide entirely with Don Kalb, is that it's because his vision of capitalism was not political enough. That's it.
Our next speaker will be Antonio Pusceddu. It's also on environment. Then we'll go to Sharryn Kasmir on labor, and then Don Nonini.
Thank you. So I'll be speaking again on political ecology. For obvious reasons, some aspects will overlap, so I will try to skip all the points that, in a way, were already mentioned by Jaume. I think I will try to present a slightly different perspective from that of Jaume. And what I want to discuss is to give some thoughts on the what I think is the continuing relevance of the Europe and the people without history for what I would call an anthropologically minded political ecology. It is a political ecology practiced and conceived on anthropological grounds. My focus is mainly on Wolff's method, and I'm not addressing what is missing in Europe in Wolff's project, but I'm trying to elaborate on how it could still provide a productive framework. To do so, I address two questions. First, what is the political ecology of Europe and the people without history? And second, how can we connect the book's method, and particularly its Marxian perspective, to more recent contribution on Marx's ecological crisis theory? And more in particular, I'll refer to Paul Barkett's discussion of value-form approach. I want to start by highlighting 2 points of Wolff's Marxian framework. And first is undogmatic use of Marx's concept, and second, the centrality of the production-nature nexus, and Wolff's careful consideration, in my opinion, of ecological factors in the analysis of the modus productions as ways of, quote, mobilizing social labor in the transformation of nature. Wolff himself, in the 1997 preface, underlines how Marxian theory helping locate the people anthropology has studied in the fields of force to which they become subject. And he did so after a careful work of conceptual refining, through which concepts such as social labor and mode of production become explanatory tools capable of accounting for and explaining a totality of interconnected processes. The analytical recrafting of Marx's view of the dialectical relationship between human production and nature will capture such pragmatical approach, as Wolff takes from Marx the basic notion that social life is shaped by the ways human beings engage nature through production. His engagement with human-environment relationships and ecology, as mentioned by Jaume, dates back to his personal intellectual trajectory since the collaboration with Julian Stewart. However, we may say that it's in the Euro and people without history that Wolff's direct engagement with Marx's concept provides the theoretical and analytical linchpin for his explanatory endeavor, that is, a sense of the principal strategic relations that make things move. I want to call your attention to one apparently meaningless aspect of Wolff's citations from Marx, because when citing a well-known passage from Capital about human-nature relations and social labor, Wolff cites Marx indirectly through Alfred Schmidt's book, The Concept of Nature in Marx, which was a book dissertation of Alfred Schmidt published in German for the first time and translated in English in 1971. I think it's interesting to know that until the 1990s, Schmidt's work was conventionally considered the only contribution to Marxian ecology after Engels' Dialectics of Nature. And someone observed, perhaps the most influential study ever written on Marx's view of nature. And I find it intriguing that Wolff uses one of the few existing studies at the time of Marx's view of nature to outline the strategic concept of his opus magnum. It relies on Schmidt's work to like the basic abstractions mobilized in Europe and the people without history, reiterating, I think this is important, the relevance of the transformation of nature as a central point of the mode of production. There's a whole range of problems that I think were rightly addressed by Jaume. I'm not going to it, and how he actually managed to really account for this aspect from theory to historical analysis. This indirect citation from Schmidt also contains the only reference to the Marxian idea of a metabolic interaction, a concept that would later acquire a relevant position in the rediscussion of Marx ecology, and I'm thinking to John Bellamy Foster's theory of the metabolic rift. This helps me reconnect Europe and the people with a history to a more ecologically minded Marxian debate and ask whether Wolff's method and pragmatic approach to theory, which I think is useful to stress, can help us put at work ethnographically and empirically, as well as through historical analysis, Marx's ecological crisis theory. Such theory fundamentally rests on the assumption, nicely summarized by Jason Moore, that the alienation of nature and the alienation of human production are two sides of a single contradiction. I want to start to say a few things about Wolff's relation with political ecology. Very few, because Jaume presented quite a lot about it. It is true that in this paper, I focus mainly on political ecology as a processual approach to the complexities of human-environment interrelations, strongly concerned, certainly with politics, and on a more methodological level with issues of scale, articulation, connections, and differentiation. It is true that Wolff is conventionally credited for recasting the term political ecology through the lens of political economy in the early 70s, and although he did not coin the term, though it's often credited for doing so, the way he used it for the first time in English laid the basis for a different understanding of the interconnection of ecological and political processes, with greater attention to the complexity of scales, processes, and connections that characterizes any specific locale. And I think there's hardly any doubt that some ideas that Eric Wolff put in that short text, ownership and political economy, really a brief commentary. Ideas like battleground of contending forces, of that of the factors over which the community has little control, or that local rules are mechanisms that mediate the pressures emanating from the larger society, and even the case for greater knowledge of social and political history and the need to study intergroup relations in wider structural fields. I may say that these are all points that have now entered the basic methodological outlook of political ecology. But I also think that these are revealing of Wolff's subsequent work, not only the already mentioned book with John Kalb, but also Europe and the People Without History. And I think that the book would exert a continuing influence on political ecology, this is my opinion, as a magisterial method of articulating scales, specificities, variations in global processes. I think I want to jump directly to to contradictions, and I skipped the part of connections for time. Because I think this is the part I would like to emphasize. Let me just know that about the importance of analysis of interconnected processes. As we know, Wolff's analytical option to characterize, to explain interdependencies and connections, not just to describe them and their consequences, Wolff's analytical option was the mode of production. And I think this is important because this idea drew attention at one and at the same time to the human relations to the natural environment, the social relations of humans to humans, the institutional structures of state and society that guide these relations, and the ideas through which these relationships are conveyed. So at least theoretically, all the issues of state and politics are there. So I will now try to reconnect with conceptual framework to Marx's environmental crisis theory, bringing into focus the anti-ecological tendencies of the capitalist mode of production. Wolf's grand historical fresco emphasizes the great novelty represented by the capitalist mode of production as a qualitatively new mode of mobilizing social labor in the transformation of nature. We know the defining feature is the capacity of monetary wealth to buy labor power to produce more wealth, but there are actually some aspects of his notion that certainly may need a thorough update. But I want to insist on one aspect, that is that clearly Wolf points out that expansion of capital is an inherently contradictory process which makes it always unstable. And I quote, ceaseless capital accumulation coupled with ever-rising levels of productivity through investment in technology produces odd and contradictory results, end of quote. It's true that among the contradictory results leading to recurring crises, ecological crises are never mentioned, though we may say ever-rising levels of productivity through investment in technology appear as sources of ecological contradictions in the transformation of nature, or one may say they significantly alter the social metabolism with nature. Common wisdom in environmental thinking has held that for a long time Marx did not consider the environmental consequences of ceaseless capital accumulation, either because of his productivist of Promethean vision, for which even communist liberation will rest on the idea of complete domination of nature, or because capital accumulation revealed its main destructive consequences, mainly during the 20th century. And eco-Marxist thinkers such as James O'Connor expanded Marx's crisis theory by pointing to the natural conditions of production. Others focused on the reconstruction of Marx's approach to nature, society, and environmental crisis, arguing that Marx's treatment of natural conditions already possessed an inherent logic that envisioned the fundamental ecological contradictions of capital accumulation. I want to briefly refer to the reconstruction of Marx's environmental crisis theory in the work of Paul Barket, Marx and Nature. And I want to argue that Jaume, the People Without Histories method provides a valuable framework to refine Marx's environmental crisis theory for anthropological research and understanding. I mean, it still can be useful to strategically useful. At the same time, I also argue that Wolf's work deployment of some basic concepts can be fruitfully put at work in the attempt to mobilize Marx's ecological crisis theory for the study of the socio-ecological complexities entailing the contemporary ecological crisis theory. Barker's aim in his in-depth analysis of Marx's approach to nature, society, and capital crisis was twofold. One was to provide counter-arguments to the idea that Marx's approach was unsuitable to understand the contemporary ecological crisis, and second, that the core of Marxian theory, specifically the labor theory of value, still carries seminal elements to outline an environmental crisis theory. Summarizing the basic argument of Barket, he aims at showing that Marx concerns for the anti-ecological tendencies of capital, and there are some points of contact between Barket and Wolf, at least I'm seeing them. Barket's starting point is the concept of human production and the place of nature in Marx's materialist conception of history, and that brings Barket's analysis closer to Wolf's elaborations of Europe and the People Without History strategic concepts. And for different purposes, they start from the Marxian view of human production as part of the material metabolism between people and nature. involving human labor operating in and through specific conditions and under definite natural conditions. Bergen proceeds with a careful analysis of Marx's treatment of natural conditions as constitutive requirements of production, and also through an extensive discussion of Marx's notion of wealth. And both Wolff and Bergen place great emphasis on humans' metabolic relations with nature and the everlasting nature-imposed condition of human existence, and the socially organized form of this relation, for all, as you know, the mode of production. A fundamental step in Bergen's examination is the value-form approach to capitalism nature, since the social roots of capitalist environmental crisis tendencies are only fully revealed when one considers the tension with nature built into the value form of commodities, money and capital. And it is the fundamental fact that under capitalism, humans' metabolic relations with nature are mediated by capitalist value form and is essential contradiction between use value and exchange value. In the words of Bergen, the contradiction between exchange value and use value intrinsic to the commodity is also a contradiction between wealth, specifically capitalist form and its natural basis and substance. The premises of value form production is that laborers are socially separated from the natural conditions of production. And value relations are therefore not only the source of alienation of labor, but also the source of the alienation of nature. And money, as a general equivalent of value, is not only the direct reification of universal labor time, but also a form of social existence separated from the natural existence of the commodity. And it is this temporal annihilation that capital accumulation produces from the natural condition of production that generates insoluble contradiction. To conclude, although value theory is not openly brought up in Europe and the people without history, some part, like chapter 11, the movement of commodities, provides, I believe, extensive examples of the alienation of labor and the alienation of nature as two sides of the same contradictory process in the global chains of commodity production. I'm thinking on the section on foodstuff or industrial crops like rubber or palm oil. And likewise, the discussions of regional specialization in the same chapter provides useful examples of how capitalist tendency toward environmental crisis implicates the spatial organization of capital accumulation as new crops are implanted in new regions, redesigning the geographies of labor mobility and regional ecologies. Let me just mention a few questions and I stop. Yes, 2 questions and I close. Which a question that I pose to myself is, how can the value form approach help explain empirical connections and intersections between situated contexts and broader structural processes? How can we account for diversified experiences of the complexities of the ecological crisis to the fragmented geographies of commodity chains? And I think these are eventually crucial questions for anthropologically minded political ecology for which Wolff's method can still be productive. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned, Sharryn Kasmir is not feeling well this morning. As we know, the world is like that. So I will read her paper, which is on Eric Wolff in relation to ideas of labor. There is widespread agreement that Eric Wolff's Peasant Wars of the 20th Century was a profoundly political book, unabashed in its concern for who was most likely to engage in revolutionary activity and what kinds of alliances led to transformative social change in different historical cases. Close the quotes. Wolff's urgency regarding Third World Revolution was tied to his participation in anti-Vietnam War protests. He organized the first teach-ins at the University of Michigan with others. And as chair of the AAA Ethics Committee, he led a charge to condemn anthropologists' collaboration with US counterinsurgency in Thailand, etc. Wolff's groundbreaking peasant research focused on the dispossession of rural cultivators how they made disposable and pushed into labor markets, how they were made disposable, pushed into labor markets. He cared deeply about the ways that the expansion of capital made rural people's lives uncertain and vulnerable. Documenting dispossession, crisis, and insecurity among peasants led Woolf to explore inquietude, alliance, organizations, social movements, and revolutions. Does the last chapter of Europe and the People Without History offer a similar analysis for workers? Is the quotes, the new laborers to workers, what peasant wars was to rural cultivators? Woolf's anthropology was informed by his childhood in the 1930s among textile workers in the German Czech region of Bohemia. Early in life, he saw how capital crisis upended people's lives. His student and close colleague, Jane Schneider, believed that this, quotes, formed the central question of his anthropology: how to account for the emergence and persistence of a system whose dynamically unfolding relations can catapult the social and cultural arrangements of everyday life into an abyss of uncertainty, as if by an act of nature, like an earthquake. A preoccupation with socioeconomic earthquakes shapes Europe and the People Without History, including the final chapter on laborers in the second half of the 19th century. Woolf paid attention to path-specific capital investments, plantation, industrial, colonial, as they drew labor forces from many parts of the world and created divisions among them. Woolf knew that capital accumulation is always uneven, both spatially and by sector. The labor market, or the calling up of laborers in his words, is therefore also uneven. Here, capital summons low-paid women and children, there higher-waged men tending machines. Woolf used Marxian economist David Gordon's concept of labor market segmentation to explain these processes. The segmentation argument drives the chapter. Woolf insists on the plural working classes over the singular working class for the ways distinct groups are brought into the labor force, composed internally and related to other social groups. He explains the 19th century English working class was comprised by a multiplicity of tradespeople employed in small factories. In contrast, the Russian working class was rapidly proletarianized by massive industrial investment. Textile mills in industrial New England employed young, unmarried women, while Bombay mills hired adult married males, and South African mines drew workers from tribal areas and reservations who returned to their kin and rural homestead at the end of their contracts. Furthermore, beyond the wage nexus, quotes, ties of kinship and relationship spanning villages of origin and the new neighborhoods of industrial locations, quotes, end quotes, shaped class formation. Quotes, this wider web of connection also shaped politics, the ability of particular working classes to challenge employers and governments, to organize associations, labor unions, and parties, and to improve the conditions of work and lives. Given this opening, we expect Woolf to delve into how this web of connection and working class politics in the 19th century. We anticipate a discussion of the associations and organizations formed by groups of workers with whom they allied and with whom they did not, tactics they used, and their aspirations and attempts to transcend their condition. Woolf explored these subjects for rural cultivators in peasant wars, but he doesn't do it for the new laborers in this chapter. With the concept of labor segmentation, Woolf intended more than a rubric for categorized labor. He showed how labor fractions were made in the measure of time with the unfolding of capitalist relations. Yet once he located laborers in their new settings, for example, factories in the US or coffee plantations in Brazil, the action slows in his narrative, and new laborers don't do much in the way of making their own history. In 1982, the year of Europe and Without peoples at publication. The political winds had decidedly shifted away from the revolutionary Third World struggles that fired Woolf's political activism and writing of the peasant wars. The winds had also changed for organized labor. In the US, Ronald Reagan dealt a decisive blow to the union movement when he summarily fired striking air traffic controllers in 1981, and Margaret Thatcher in the UK when she crushed the miners' strike. I think that was 78. These devastating defeats were the tip of the iceberg. In hindsight, we grasp how the disorganization of labor, its generalized disempowerments in relation to capital and the state, engendered chaos in the lives of working people. Even if this reality was not yet fully apparent at the beginning of the decade, the imperative to re-energize working class organization and alliance was already palpable. Rather, I'm struck that the chapter is not imbued with the urgency these developments might have inspired. The disorganization of working classes then underway should have underscored the importance of unions, parties, and mass movements for the period under Woolf's consideration, the industrial epoch of the 19th century. Yet there is little in the chapter about these institutions and developments. Equally, there is little passion for their cause, neither for recording how they sometimes achieved unity, leverage, and rights for workers, nor for documenting how they often failed to do so. There are few references to labor union strikes or even race riots among workers, of which the mid-19th century and early 20th century were replete. Woolf tells how distinct labor forces are called up by capital expansion, but falls short of showing how the new laborers acceded to, resisted, or organized against the segmentation. He demarcated the sociology of working classes, but didn't sketch the political paths that they themselves forged. His analysis is spatial, historical, and relational, but is not political, at least not in the spirit of peasant wars. Instead, the politics of the chapter are rooted in the earthquakes of academia. Woolf quotes the New Labourers, the chapter, by naming working classes as people without history. Their history, he affirms, was just them being written, as it was for populations traditionally studied by anthropologists. Those supposedly rested upon some timeless plateau of evolution. This opening defined Woolf's project as an academic one about historiography and social science and anthropology. In Woolf's assessment, workers had been the object of narrow, instrumentalist academic research that paid little attention to what was present, the relational matrix and content of working class existence. He reproached social scientists who undertook only, quotes, problem solving, the problem being what to do about the workers, and labor historians who wrote about unions and parties the workers created to transcend their condition, but who neglected the lives of working people. Therefore, Woolf wrote about what was what was already there among European immigrant workforces in the US, African and European mine workers in South Africa, East Indians and Europeans tied to colonial plantations, and Chinese laborers in Singapore, Peru, California, and beyond. In each case, he showed that ethnic, national, racial, and/or gendered groups are called up into sectors of the labor market by divergent processes of capital accumulation with enduring consequences for their conditions of life and work. His account was not reductive, as Jane Schneider notes. There is no grand design to divide and rule to enhance workers' exploitability. Rather, Woolf's analysis seeks to connect the process of labeling to people's differentiated engagement with capital and expansion rather than the, requirements of capital. I'm going to shorten Sharryn's paper because it's already time. But Woolf was a lightning rod for culture turners such as Paul Rabinow, and a lot of his argument has to do with that postmodern turn that I mentioned. And I think that's what Sharryn is pointing out, that that was where it was focused, rather than on a new and more a broader analysis of working class movements that we are still awaiting or have been working on for the past 40 years. Not like the Communist Manifesto, not like peasant wars, but with a fundamental basis for looking at the next set of questions. Thank you. John Nonini. Yeah. I said everything she said, I just didn't repeat it.
Sorry, I'm going high-tech on you. Okay, oh, good. All right. Good. The title of my paper and the broad theme in which I'm talking today is really about Eric Wolf and his encounters with the curious idea of race, being somewhat ironic there. But I'm delighted to see that many of the, several of the papers that preceded this one deal directly with some of the issues, some of the unresolved questions about exactly what relationship Wolf had in his writings and how he theorized the politics of capitalism. And I'm suggesting strongly that one of the places where he fails to adequately theorize is definitely in the question of race. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about his writing, saying much about his shortcomings. I'm going to summarize them quickly. We can come back to them. What I'm focusing on instead is an alternative, if you will, vision of capitalism and capitalist modernity, in which race plays a far more central role along with capitalism, and where the capitalist state in particular plays a crucial role in the history of capitalism, modern capitalism. Okay. All right. Okay. I was this first came to mind for me when I realized that an important book, Decolonializing Anthropology, that Faye Harrison wrote, in which I played a marginal role in, but Faye Harrison was a co-author with me on Du Bois and his influence in anthropology. And I began to think more and more about what it was in Europe and the People Without History and in Wolf's other writings led something to be desired. And in fact, Faye picked up on this much more quickly than I did when she wrote that for cross-cultural knowledge to advance human emancipation, activist intellectuals must move beyond what many Marxists and other progressives have contributed. It is not enough to rethink anthropological insights in light of an historicized political economy. Okay? And so why was this mentioned? Why was Europe and the People Without History mentioned so prominently in what was published in 1991 and has become, in a way, an important and crucial statement about the role of race and in contemporary anthropology? So, quickly, here are the key contentions of this paper: that the modern state is the source, and I mean the modern capitalist state, is the source of the structural power of racialization and race-making processes. 2, that the state's racialization and race-making operate in tandem with, but with also a critical degree of autonomy from capitalism and the capitalist mode of production. State racialization of core and peripheral populations of empires came into existence at the same time as European industrial capitalism and dates from the 17th century and has continued up to the present. 4th, state racialization makes possible and undertakes expropriation of groups deemed essentially inferior by the racial group in power. It confiscates not only labor power, but many other kinds of use values. And here, use value has to be re-theorized, clearly. And it supports, state racialization supports markets that transform these use values into money capital on behalf of state agencies, capitalists, and their class and racial allies. 5th, we can theorize racialized expropriation as an additional source of surplus value to that of the capital-labor relations of exploitation that enter indirectly, or rather this racialized expropriation enters indirectly into what David Harvey in his recent 2018 book referred to as value in motion, or circuits of capital. That is, expropriated surplus value provides one solution in particular to capitalism in times of crises of overaccumulation. Finally, and this is where I'm just going to mention this and won't say, well, I'll say a little bit about it. Eric Wolf in Europe and the People Without History paid insufficient attention to racialization and thus to race, expropriation, or expropriation's contribution of surplus value to value in motion because of the theoretical shortcomings in his analysis of capitalist states and the relationship to capitalism. Okay. Okay, so I go in the larger paper, which is quite long. I go through several historical and contemporary examples that illustrate the claims that I've just laid out in these 6 major contentions of the paper. I go through the independent history of racialized discourses among medieval European elites toward early modern European states based on Herrenvolk, Anglo-Saxonism, Nordicism, and other racial ideologies. I turn to the racialization of the Irish people by the English state from the 14th through the 18th century. I turn to the making of whiteness and racialization of Africans in the British royal colony of Virginia in the 17th century. I look briefly at the 16th and 17th centuries European state formation, and thanks to Dawn for pointing out that this is Protestant state formation, and I probably should have left the French out perhaps, but in any event, 16th and 17th centuries European state formations and their connections to the imperial corporate states of the royal companies tied to large-scale racialized expropriation in the empires created. Then I take the example of the modern Chinese diaspora, which I know a little bit about ethnographically and historically in Southeast Asia, Australia, and the Americas, and review the ongoing expropriations arising from European colonial rule and the racialization of the Chinese population. Finally, I look briefly at the expropriations of the use values of African Americans in the contemporary United States as a form of amped up digitalized surveillance and neoliberalized modes of control, or rather coming out of these modes of control, we have other kinds of expropriations. Okay. So the theoretical issues that are ones in Wolf's work that are of concern, I'm just going to go through these very quickly. In his essay, the 1994 essay for the Sidney Mintz lecture, he called Perilous Ideas, Race, Culture, and People. He sees contemporary racism not as a structural characteristic of a system, capitalism or otherwise, but as a psychological mechanism. The book, Europe and the People Without History, indexes capitalism more than 60 times, while race is mentioned only once, as in the phrase racial distinctions and labor markets. Europe and the People Without History sees race as subsidiary to capitalism, in that race functions in a certain way to advance capitalists and capital accumulation, and a kind of circular argument with respect to what race really is. As in when he says the function of racial categories within industrial capitalism is exclusionary. Okay, can we tell us more? And finally, and this I cannot go into except to say that Europe and the People Without History, in its analysis of the modern capitalist state, and by extension of race and the racialization process that the state forwards, makes a teleological argument about the state with respect to capitalism. In other words, the state has to do certain things for capital, has to do certain things that show its subsidiary relationship to capitalism, and that's really what we need to know in a certain sense. Okay. Isn't race, therefore, something more than Wolff's reductions? State racialization processes are a form of structural power. Now, since Wolff advanced, and we're all in his debt, as we are from Europe and the People Without History, I should add, since Eric Wolff did advance the notion of structural power, let's hold him to that definition. And it looks very much to me that state racialization processes actually are a form of structural power. In other words, power that operates within settings, it organizes and orchestrates the settings themselves, and it shapes who gets what when. Okay, so how else then, thinking of racialization processes, not race, which is the, if you will, the effect, but racialization processes act to, have material significance, if you want to put it that way, as in the processes of widespread African enslavement, its racial, ideological, and social components, and above all, its institutional encodings in the laws and policies of the modern U.S. capitalist state up until the Civil War. Good. Okay. So I'm just going to say that Eric Wolff's vision of the capitalist state is somewhat at variance with the I think far more sophisticated vision of the capitalist state by Ralph Miliband and many other Marxist theorists of the state. Can't go into it now. Welcome your questions. Racialization is the key process here, by which the state sets the legal and political conditions in place to discriminate against specific populations deemed essentially inferior to those in power, and the state thereby legally reinforces racial hierarchies of citizenship and, by extension, non-citizenship. These can be highly graded different categories. This signals not only to capitalists but to their racial allies within civil society that these racialized groups are essentially available for specific acts of appropriation. There's a semiotics of the state, of course, here. Finally, state agencies initiate and enforce expropriations of these groups undertaken by other groups through their repressive powers. I want to make a couple more points before I conclude because I'm running out of time. Well, I'm really running out of time, but I'm going to give, I think I've been pushed a little bit. Okay. I'd like to leave you with this thought, and I'm glad to answer further questions, that expropriation of racially subordinate groups is different from the exploitation of the working class and has taken a variety of forms historically and up to the present. So I think the person who has best articulated this, the scholar, Nancy Fraser, the feminist philosopher, when she writes that, quote, distinct from Marxian exploitation, expropriation is accumulation by other means, dispensing with the contractual relation through which capital purchases labor power in exchange for wages, what Marx wrote so well about. Expropriation works by confiscating capacities and resources and conscripting them into capital's circuits of self-expansion, which is the theoretical link I think that we need to make here. And the theoretical critique against Wolff's innocent view, or rather naive view of race. Finally, expropriation can take many forms. It may, as she puts it, be, quote, blatant and violent, as in New World slavery, or it may be veiled by a cloak of commerce, as in the predatory loans and debt foreclosures of the present era. The confiscated assets may be labor, land, animals, tools, mineral, or energy deposits. And here I want to refer to how this connects up to appropriation of nature that Jaume and Antonio both referred to, right? So this comes in, expropriation, but also human beings, their sexual and reproductive capacities, their children and bodily organs. That's Nancy Fraser's important essay. So I'll conclude on that note because I hope we have enough people here to have some really lively conversation about this, and I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. Our discussant is Oana Mateescu, and she's going to talk for a few minutes. Thank you.
I'll be super brief. I feel privileged and at the same time humbled to be commenting on a set of such to be commenting on a set of such complex papers, and the papers are really much more complex than the presentations that you've heard so far. I have basically 3 lines of questioning or commenting, and I will not address each paper separately, but I will rather address you all and the connections that are immediately visible among your presentations. First of all of you are concerned with the blind spots in the book, the silences, the things that Eric Wolf has missed, either due to academic politics, either due to his own interest in crafting a particular kind of story of capitalism, and I will get back to that point. So for Don, Nonini, but also for Sharryn, race is one of those main absences, and particularly not just a description, but a theory of race. For Don Kalb, it is liberalism as an ideology, but also the bourgeois revolution and implicitly class formation. For Jaume and for Antonio, it is nature, but not just nature, a politics of nature. And Jaume puts it very clearly when he says that nature for Eric Wolf is simply not political enough. And this is something that recurs in all the papers. It is not political enough when it comes to the politics of the new laborers, when it comes to race, when it comes to nature, or when it comes to ideology in a very broad sense. Now, in Eric Wolf's defense, we might say that once people start to actually make their own politics, they are no longer people without history. So perhaps that might explain in a very, very slight sense his own silences. But, and here is my first question for all of you. What are your own blind spots as inheritors of a particular tradition of political economy that has been partially shaped by Eric Wolf? And I do realize this is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek question, but it leads me to my next one. What if we translate the title of the book nowadays into something like Capital and the People Without Future? Because really, when he means Europe, he means capital. And when he means history, or when we mean history in our sense, or when we call for more history in the understanding of capital, perhaps we should also be calling for more future, a sense of futurity. And here, I'm not just talking about utopias, although, of course, those are also critical and important, but I'm also talking about a particular mode of theorizing. Let's call it preemptive theorizing, a kind of theory that preempts the worst excesses and the worst derapages of capitalism. So perhaps we should start to get ahead of what capitalism may become rather than, look back and think retrospectively. Here I get also to my last point. Europe and the People Without History is not just a theory, it's also a story. Over the summer, as I was rereading the book in preparation for this conference and for the conference at Bergen, I was at home. I'm from Romania, from a small village, a post-peasant, let's say, and I was talking to my mother and summarizing each chapter every night. And she was entranced. She said, "This is such a great story. And why didn't anybody tell us what capitalism was like before 1989? Well, I told her, the party did tell you what capitalism was like. But she said, the party didn't tell a good story, as opposed to Eric Wolf. Now, you might find this strange because Wolf has been notoriously criticized for his lack of narrative finesse. Some people even think, he writes like an accountant. But what is it, in fact, in his mode of narration, in his mode of storytelling, which my mother called it cinematic? It is like a film. She can she can follow the things moving, the slave ships, the commodities, the beavers. She was fascinated by the beavers, and she was tracing all the paths on an atlas. Everything is moving there, but also coming together in a broader story. And it is strange that such a narrow theory of capitalism, as you have all called it, his Brennerian approach to capitalism, should generate a book that is so audacious in geographical and historical scale, and a book that is such a good story. So, finally, how should we narrate preemptively or not the coming form of capitalism? Don Kalb called for a more expansive notion. Jaume was talking about the purity, critically about the purity of Woolf's notion, so perhaps we should be looking for impure modes of narration, be dirtier than we have been so far. Perhaps we should also be more recursive, as Don Nonini was pointing out in his paper when he was talking about these discontinuous but at the same time recursive histories that we can see when we look more closely at racialization and expropriation. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Okay, our time is really up. I don't think we have many questions. I just wanted to, there's not that many people. If there's a pressing question, but otherwise, this is a book of thinking in process. And as Oana said, perhaps we have to look to the future. And thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be more. We take your questions in the future, if not now. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.